I did it wrong again. Okay. So, welcome back, everybody. I'm not going to try that again. This is the second chapter of our second unit of AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. So, welcome back, everybody. Hope you're having a great old day, whatever day it is you're watching this. Well, let's begin. So, the bellwork on the screen identify three things that are being diffused along the Silk Road: religion, culture, etc. All those things count as well. Let's get started by talking about everybody's favorite topic in AP World History, the Mongols. Dun, 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 dun. The Mongols, yes. Let's talk about the guys and gals who are going to unify Eurasia and promote the silk trade. If we're thinking about the theme of this unit, networks of exchange, it's the Mongols who are really going to promote that to an extreme, as we're going to see today, and for at least two more chapters. So the lesson objective today is the first of our three-part series on the Mongols. Yes, you're going to be able to explain the process of state building and decline in Mongol society over time. So, state building, how do states emerge? How do empires emerge? And decline, how do empires fall apart? So let's first look at kind of the starting point for the Mongols. And where do the Mongols start out? Well, they're going to start out in Central Asia, specifically in an area that is modern-day Mongolia, parts of Russia and parts of China. And largely, we call this natural environment the steppes, which is what I talked about in our previous presentation. The steppes are going to be the location for the Mongols where they will start out. And we are going to see that these steppes are going to be not really suitable for sedentary farming. Rather, much of Mongol society is going to practice what we call nomadism. And nomadism, of course, is like pastoralism. It means moving from place to place, basically not staying in one spot over an extended period of time. So the steppes are going to be important in determining how do the Mongols develop, because the steppes, much like the desert of the Arabian Peninsula, for example, is going to be limited in natural resources. We are going to see that Mongols, as a result of the lack of natural resources, they're going to have to do two things. In order to get manufactured products like metal, in order to get grain, they've got to either raid or trade with the Chinese. That's probably their biggest trade partners, but also with groups in Central Asia, other nomadic societies, sedentary Islamic societies as well. So we do see that this will foster a kind of mentality of either raiding or trading. The Mongols are not a unified society in any possible way, but it's more so a collection of culturally similar tribes. And yet these tribes oftentimes do engage in frequent conflict, either with themselves, oftentimes there is competition for pasture land, but also with sedentary societies. The Mongols will be one of the many Central Asian nomadic societies that have raided Chinese dynasties in the past, and they're no exception after Genghis Khan, as we'll talk about. But there are frequent contacts between the Chinese, especially, and the Mongols. The Mongols, as we'll talk about later, they're going to adapt a lot of things that they get from China, especially technology, but we'll get there. But let's look at kind of society in a second, because this is going to help explain why the Mongols will rise, but also, in a way, why they'll fall. So, as we discussed earlier, the Mongols are largely going to be a nomadic society. They are moving from pasture to pasture, largely moving their herds of sheep and goats, using horses, moving across the Central Asian steppes. So sometimes they'll stay in one region for a season, and then they'll move on for another season. But as with many pastoral societies, there is going to be a kind of similar social structure. So many nomadic societies, the Mongols included, are going to largely be tribal or family based. So many times people are these Mongols, they are moving with their families, their extended families from place to place, following the seasons, directing their herds. They oftentimes live in these tents that I show up here. They're called yurts. So much of the loyalty and much of the community organization is based around the family, based around especially kind of the extended immediate family. But these families are a part of a wider organization, a tribal unit. So there are different tribes. They have their own kind of tribal leaders. They are often sometimes called the Mongol nobles. But despite that name, these tribes are going to have kind of a limited hierarchy, except when there's a crisis. Because oftentimes, if there is a common enemy facing all of the tribes of the Mongol Confederacy, we will see that they will unite together and elect a figure called a Great Khan, or a Khan, I should call them. And a Khan essentially is the military leader that unites different Mongol tribes together to face a common enemy. And Mongols oftentimes do face a common enemy. That common enemy by the 1200s is the Qin dynasty, which is that northern kingdom that will emerge after the Liao dynasty collapses in northern China and Manchuria. And the Qin dynasty and other previous dynasties in China oftentimes do engage in kind of conflict against these Mongol troops, against these Mongol societies. And that is going to kind of promote this idea of needing to defend Mongol society. So that will help explain why the Mongols will start conquering places. But if there is ever a crisis, Mongols oftentimes will get together, their tribes get together and elect a figure known as a Khan. But for the most part, these tribes, these societies, while they will have tribal leaders, there's really little set hierarchy. It is extremely decentralized. So if we're thinking about how that will impact the Mongols later on, well, keep that in the back of your head. So these Mongols are going to largely be decentralized in their power structures. Much of the time, it's more focused on day-to-day concerns. Communities make their decisions for the good of their community. And that's really going to lead to a kind of less formal hierarchy in Mongol society. People will be promoted, not necessarily because of their family background, but because of their skill, for example. But another example of this limited hierarchy is that women have it kind of better than women in other societies. Mongol women, while oftentimes they do have to kind of perform household chores, while they are kind of expected to not stay exclusively in the yurt, but they are expected to manage the domestic affairs. Women are oftentimes on the same social level as men. Women can have political roles, they can be advisors, they can be shamans, they can be kind of female religious leaders. That's what a shaman basically is. So women do have a lot of rights in Mongol society, and actually they'll get some more rights once we talk about Genghis later on. But that's just something that is unique to the Mongols, and that actually might be a question you might see. Mongol women do have kind of a greater social standing than, say, women in China, women in the Song dynasty specifically. But in terms of religion, the decentralized nature of Mongol society is going to lead to a lot of diversity in terms of religion. We do have a variety of different practices the Mongols have. Some Mongols are Christian, Nestorian Christians, other Mongols are Muslims, but some Mongols belong to a religion known as Tengrism. And Tengrism essentially is the native Mongolian religion. It is a polytheistic animistic religion in which the sky god Tengri is the most important, but it's not really a kind of religion that expects you to convert to its practices. Mongols are very culturally and religiously tolerant and diverse, and that will help us kind of see and understand why the Mongols will be religiously tolerant under Genghis Khan. So let's look at another aspect of Mongol society that does help explain the speed of their conquests, but also will help explain kind of why they will be able to be the largest land based empire in human history. And if there's one thing to remember about the Mongols, largest land based empire in history. The largest empire is the British, but we'll get there in Unit 6. Don't worry. Or worry, I guess, if you're from India or Ireland or, Africa. Well, let's look at warfare with the Mongols after that. Well, God save the Queen, by the way. Am I right? Anyway, so let's look at warfare. So, in terms of warfare, there are some things that make the Mongols unique. In this class, we don't really pay attention to military history all that much, but it does matter in terms of the Mongols. But let's look at what makes them effective militarily. Well, for one thing, the Mongols are adaptable. They're already starting out pretty good because they mostly use horseback warfare. So they're able to cover vast distances very quickly and with great speed. Well, never mind. So they're able to cover a vast amount of territory very quickly. But the Mongols are also adaptable. They're able to adapt and utilize technology that they acquire from conquered people, especially from, say, the Chinese. So the Mongols will acquire short bows. They will use those effectively on horseback. They're able to shoot down infantry, which is non-horseback warfare, which is non-horseback soldiers, I should say. But eventually, they also will incorporate things like gunpowder into their military, things like catapults, things like battering rams. So the Mongols are very adaptive. They're especially going to adapt technology from the Chinese. And they're getting all of this technology either through previous trade contacts, gunpowder, one of these commodities exchanged, or through just, conquering them via horseback warfare and overwhelming them so as to take their technology, force them to surrender. But the Mongols are able to communicate and coordinate their strategy very effectively. They utilize something called the Yam system, aka the sweet potato system. Haha, Mr. Ancharsky, you're so funny. Ha ha ha. No, but what is the Yam system? Well, before I even explain what it is, the Yam system is basically the game of telephone. So basically, one messenger would go a certain amount of miles, then they would end up at a relay station. They would pass on the message to somebody else, and then the new messenger would carry it on to another station. So they're able to communicate over vast distances. That helps explain why the Mongols are so militarily effective, but also why they are so, how shall I say it, able to conquer such vast amounts of territory. But the Mongols are also skilled in terms of being very brutal. The Mongols do oftentimes prefer that people surrender, but they won't hesitate to burn a village down as you do. The Mongols are going to be extremely brutal in some of their military conquests, and they do this kind of to establish a reputation for themselves. If you hear that the village the Mongols just conquered, what happened to them, their heads all cut off, I don't want to get too violent with all of this, but brutal things happening to them. Sometimes villages will say, okay, let's just surrender before those bad things can happen to us, basically. The Mongols oftentimes send spies into places, they scout out the region before they invade it. So they are going to be very brutal in their conquest, in their tactics as well. I could talk about kind of other Mongol strategies, but it's just important to realize that the Mongols are kind of establishing themselves as being very fierce fighters. And that's going to kind of lead to groups of people preferring to surrender and pay tribute rather than be destroyed by them. Regardless, however, the Mongols, according to some historians, according to some primary sources, which should be taken with a grain of truth, are going to be responsible for a lot of depopulation in Central Asia and East Asia, especially. The Mongols, for example, some historians estimate are responsible for killing 10% of the world's population between 1206 and the 1300s. And that's not even counting the Black Death that we'll talk about later. Yeah, but we'll get there. Yeah, the Mongols are pretty cool. Well, I mean, they're cool because, like gender equality and whatnot, and, religious tolerance and trade being promoted. But, I guess it's not cool dismembering people. But anyway, so you should be able to describe Mongol society, especially prior to Genghis Khan, but also kind of what are some innovations that make them militarily effective. So let's look at the Mongols basically conquering the known world, because the Mongols, as we're going to see, between Genghis Khan's conquest that we're going to talk about now and his descendants' conquest that we'll talk about later, they're going to control a huge land-based empire from modern-day Hungary all the way to Vietnam, from Russia all the way to Iran. It's a huge empire that the Mongols will establish. So let's take a look at it. But before that, we got to look at the man himself. We got to look at Genghis Khan. He's also called Genghis Khan in Mongolian. He was born Temujin. But let's look at it. Well, the basic thing about Genghis Khan is that he is going to be the one largely responsible for much of these early conquests in about a 20-year period, as we're going to see. Genghis Khan is going to be very notable because he is going to unite these different tribes of Mongols together through negotiation, through warfare, and he is going to be elected Great Khan by tribal leaders by 1206. But in Genghis Khan, a lot of these nobles are noticing that he's a great organizer. He's an extremely effective military commander. He's a charismatic guy. He gets fame for rescuing his kidnapped wife. He actually sticks with his first wife for the rest of his life, actually, and raises one of a son that she might have had outside of marriage. So cool guy overall. I guess if he didn't kill 10% of the world's population, he would have been a perfect human being. Well, we'll get to why he's not a perfect human being later. But he's able to command the loyalty of his followers. He's a great centralizing, unifying figure. It'd be a shame if he died suddenly, leaving his empire to fall apart. But we'll get there. So Genghis Khan is able to organize a vast amount of people, but he's also going to be a well-respected guy. He promotes people based on their he promotes people based on their merit, on their skill. He's going to be very just and very equal in his judgments and punishments that he gives out to people. And he's going to establish for himself a very fair reputation once he passes something called the Great Law. And the Great Law is a series of laws that essentially will unify these Mongol tribes under a shared legal code. It's going to establish the position of a figure known as a great judge, the supreme judge, rather. The supreme judge essentially mediates disputes between the tribes. And these tribes are able to unite together because there's a sense of fairness, of justice, that there isn't going to be one tribe favor over the other. So it's a very equal legal system. It is going to do a few things, actually, enshrine kind of this idea of legal fairness in Mongol society. For one thing, it is going to say that illegitimate children born out of wedlock, they can inherit their father's property. They're going to say that women can divorce their husbands. Women can have prominent advisory roles. Women can own property. They can inherit stuff from their fathers, from their parents. So women do have it, again, pretty good overall in Mongol society. Mongol women have it pretty good overall. But we also see that there are other ways that the Mongols are ensuring fairness in their society. You don't necessarily need to know all of these things, but just that it is establishing a sense of fairness and unity to help conquer basically the rest of the world. The Mongols are going to establish kind of a system in which you can't hunt animals during mating season, so they're environmentalists too. I mean, they're reducing humanity's carbon footprint in the 1200s by killing most of them. Haha, I'm so funny. All right. So let's look at kind of these early conquests by the Mongols. I'm going to have an accompanying video with this. Hopefully it's not stricken down. but I am kind of commenting on the Mongols, so I think it should stay up. And again, the Mongols are promoting based on merit rather than on family uh, connections, rather than family loyalty. So the Mongols, their main goal overall is to get stuff. And that's really going to influence what the Mongols will kind of make out of their empire. They are going to demand tribute from conquered places, and they're largely doing that because they are resource poor. They need to get stuff from other people. But there's also a degree of self-defense that the Mongols are engaging in. They're frequently being invaded by, say, the Qin dynasty in the north of what is today China. So there is going to be a degree of self-defense. And as I said earlier, the Mongols are going to be so rapid, so successful because of their military innovations, the use of gunpowder, which they will absorb from northern Chinese groups, the use of horseback warfare. And you don't necessarily need to know kind of each and every specific conquest that Genghis Khan will get involved in, but here are some examples of the places that Genghis himself will conquer with his sons, with his grandsons, with all of his best friends. He's going to knock out kind of some of the Chinese dynasties in the north of China. The Song, they're doing their own thing down here for now. But we do see there are different invasions. In 1207, Genghis Khan invades the Qin dynasty, takes their gunpowder. He invades a region called the Kormazan Empire. And he does that because, well, the Mongols killed their ambassador, these empires killed the Mongol ambassadors. So there is kind of this sense of justice, even though it's a very brutal form of justice. And this is actually where Genghis Khan will end up. He'll die in 1227, but kind of he leaves off with the conquest of the Western Xi-Xia kingdoms. And this is what Genghis Khan's empire looks like by the ascension of his son Ogadai, and we'll get to him later on. But we do see that there is a huge chunk of Central Asia that will be taken over by the time Genghis Khan dies. So it really will be up to his descendants to take over the rest of the world. And we're going to look at his descendants' conquest, because as you can see in the video right now that I'm showing, the Mongols, well, they take over a huge chunk of territory, from all the way over here from Poland to Korea, from Mongolia down to Iran. It's a huge empire, needless to say. It will break apart, but we'll get there. So let's look at how the Mongols will administer their empire, because this largely reflects their decentralized social structure. Well, the Mongols are going to realize, well, if our whole thing is to get tribute, is to get stuff from conquered people, we need a place to store all this conquered stuff to distribute it fairly amongst the tribal leaders. Well, the Mongols are going to try to do this by having kind of central repository through the creation of a capital. And this capital is called Karakorum. Karakorum is going to be kind of the center of the Mongol Empire in terms of where all the tribute is going to. And Karakorum will kind of embody some sedentary practices, actually. The Mongols will build temples, Buddhist temples. For example, you can see the reconstruction of one. Karakorum as a modern day city doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. Water. So let's look at some other ways the Mongols are administering their empire. Well, to help out with the collection of tributes, with the collection of taxes, we are going to see kind of the creation of a Mongol written language. And that language, in its written form, is known as the Uyghur script. And Uyghur script essentially is going to be kind of a blend of some Chinese characters, a blend of some Chinese alphabet, essentially. But it is going to be an example of a written language that will help out with especially the collection of tribute. You need to know, okay, this village gave so many things, this city gave so many products. You need to have it written down somewhere. You need some form of record keeping. But for the most part, the Mongols really don't care how day-to-day administration goes, how day-to-day governance goes. So the Mongols are going to promote continuity. This is very important in answering the second lesson objective of our next presentation. The Mongols are going to promote what we call continuity by keeping a lot of the same local administrators, the same local government officials in charge. Really, the Mongols do this because they're focused on moving on. They don't want to stay around and set up an empire. They want to keep conquering. They don't care how day-to-day operations go, as long as tribute's being paid, as long as you're not rebelling against the Mongols, you can stay completely the same. So oftentimes kind of local governments will stay the same as the Mongols get there. It's a very decentralized empire. But to kind of make sure that things are running efficiently, the Mongols will move some people around, especially administrators and scholars who are best in their fields. So, for example, if the Mongols were seeing that collection of tribute in, say, northern China wasn't as efficient as it could be, well, you could replace whoever was in charge of that in northern China with an Islamic scholar from, say, the Middle East. So the Mongols do oftentimes forcibly relocate artisans and scholars where they can be better used to more efficiently run local administration. So as a result, the Mongols will be responsible for a lot of cultural diffusion, and that's something we'll talk about more in our it would be our fourth presentation of Unit 2. But on top of this idea of the Mongols really not caring what local government looks like, the Mongols also are going to continue religious diversity. The Mongols really don't care what religion you practice. They're going to allow for religious tolerance, especially of things like Islam, Christianity, Buddhism. Some Mongols will become Buddhists, others will become Muslims. But for the most part, Mongols really are just going to let things happen. They aren't going to significantly alter existing government structures or existing cultural structures, i.e., religion. So you should be able to address this question right here. What accounts for how huge the Mongol Empire is, the vastness of the empire, and the speed of Mongol conquest? So you should focus on not only military technology, but also kind of politically speaking. Why are the Mongols able to move on from a place after they conquered it? So let's look at some of the impacts of the Mongols on especially networks of exchange, on especially the Silk Road. Well, the Mongols are going to see the expansion of trade under their administration. The Mongols will unify much of Eurasia, and as such, they will unify much of the core areas of the Silk Road. Well, there are a few causes for why Mongols are going to promote trade so much. For one thing, the Mongols want stuff. They demand tribute, and the demand for tribute is going to lead to the transportation of stuff, the transportation of trade goods over the Silk Road, over networks of exchange like the Silk Road. But the Mongols are also going to kind of promote trade by making it safe to trade. One single unified empire with a really fast military is going to reduce bandit attacks. But the Mongols are also going to guarantee merchant companies' safety through the issuing of a passport system. And the passport system, you can see a passport example right next to the text right there. It is going to kind of be a document of safe passage. Trying to think of I'm pretty sure there's a video game that uses this concept. Anyway, it is a form of kind of safe passage, essentially. If you have this passport on you, you are able to benefit from the Mongols' protection. You're able to be kind of treated legally, fairly in different merchant cities. So there is going to be, sorry, oh my gosh, I'm really tired. There is going to be this sense of fairness legally and safely because of the Mongols. But the Mongols are also popular among merchants because they are going to kind of limit the amount of taxes that merchants have to pay. There's only one tax that they would have to pay, and that's giving tribute to the Mongols. So there's not multiple taxes that they have to pay whenever they cross the border into a new kingdom, because there's only one kingdom they pass through, the Mongol Empire. Yes, indeed. So what are the impacts of this expansion of trade? Because the Mongols are the primary reason why Silk Road trade expands after 1200 CE. The Mongols, even though brutal across Central Asia, even though they will depopulate parts of Central Asia and East Asia, they are going to lead to the further expansion of trade. And trade results in a few things. For one thing, diffusion. We talked about that a lot last chapter, so I'm not going to go into it anymore. But another thing that is going to be promoted because of the expansion of trade is going to be the expansion of diplomatic and cultural connections. The roads are safe to travel. That means merchants can travel, sure, but also ambassadors. Diplomatic relations can be established between different empires. We also see artisans and scholars. They're able to move safely because of the Mongols. They're also being forced to in some cases, but well, you get some, you get some, you lose some. You know what I'm saying? But we also see travelers in general being able to move around the Silk Road and document what they see. And there's two very famous examples of that, and who we'll talk about later. There's Marco Polo, the Venetian guy who will go across the Silk Road. He's going to be held hostage by Kublai Khan for a few years, but we'll get there. And then he goes home. He recounts what he sees in East Asia, fueling a demand for Asian goods. But we also see guys like Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta is an Islamic scholar. He's from Morocco. We'll talk about him more later, but he's also going to document what he sees. So kind of the safety of the Silk Road is a major reason why we will see an expansion of trade and travel. But another thing we see spread is disease. And the biggest disease that spreads most likely because of the Silk Road is going to be the Black Death. And the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, its scientific name. Well, its scientific name is Yersinia pestis, but that's a different thing. That sounds like a sauce, I feel like Yersinia pesto. Anyway, so the Black Death is going to be something that will devastate the international community. We'll talk about its effects on Europe later, but it's largely spreading across the Silk Road. And there's a bit of a debate among historians. Was this intentionally spread by the Mongols, or was it unintentional? Because unintentionally, well, the promotion of trade sees the contact between different groups of people. Contact between different groups of people is going to lead, in many cases, to disease. People are moving from place to place. They're carrying with them germs. So there's that explanation. Another explanation is the Mongols basically engaged in a kind of biological warfare. They would notice that their troops are dying of something like the bubonic plague, and then they would intentionally throw into besieged cities, infected corpses to kill off the internal garrison, the inside garrison. But regardless of how it spread, the bubonic plague does spread, and it will reach Europe by the 1300s, by 1347. And arguably, this is another major cause of depopulation across the Silk Road. We do see that even though urbanization will increase in the immediate post-classical period, we are going to see by the end of it that it will decline a little bit because of disease, especially the bubonic plague. But the Mongol Empire is not going to last, and that's mostly because of the already decentralized nature of its government and social structure. So Genghis Khan, the unifier of the Mongol tribes, is going to die in 1227. It's not really clear how he died. He could have died from an infected arrow. He could have died from a nosebleed. He could have died of some disease. But regardless, Genghis Khan dies, his son has to take over. And his son's name is Ogadai. Ogadai is not going to be a very effective ruler. He's going to be kind of not the same magnetic charisma as Genghis Khan. So it's really going to see kind of the breakup of the empire into what we call 4 different khanates. And these khanates are going to be kind of divisions of the Mongol Empire that are ruled over by a descendant of Genghis Khan. So that is going to be a kind of new development in Central Asia. The empire will break up into 4 distinct khanates. And these khanates, as we'll discuss more later, include things like the Chagatai in Central Asia. We also have the Golden Horde, which is going to invade Russia. We have the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, and we got the Yuan dynasty in China. But these khanates themselves are very decentralized. We oftentimes do see that these walls are very fragile. Yeah. Oh, what was I talking about again? So we do see kind of the decentralized nature of the Mongol Empire that leads to its breakup. But a big thing about these khanates is, as we'll discuss more in our next chapter and the chapter after that, is that they are going to be kind of the inspiration, the source for many future land-based empires. So we do see that many societies in Central Asia and the Middle East, they'll try to connect their legacy to the Mongol Empire. For example, we have the Ottomans, we have the Safavids, we have the Mughals. But we also see states that form in reaction against the Mongols. For example, the Romanov dynasty in Russia. We have the Ming dynasty in China, but we'll get there later. So really we'll look more closely at the Golden Horde and the Yuan dynasty and the Ilkhanate, but let's just get the Chagatai Empire out of the way. Well, the Chagatai Empire represents a few kind of trends in many of these Central Asian houses. For one thing, it's extremely decentralized. It's run by nobles. It's run by Mongol nobles, so people who often had military experience. And for the most part, it's rather unurbanized, except of the city of Samarkand over here. But why is the Chagatai Empire important? Well, its main importance is that it's the source of inspiration for future empires, namely groups like the Timurids. The Timurids, they're going to be kind of the descendants of Mongol nobles under this guy named Timur. He's going to break away from the Chagatai Empire, form his own kingdom, and then he's going to invade northern India. So not very fun altogether. So the Chagatai Empire is going to allow for a greater expansion of future empires. And if you have time, I'd watch this video. I like it a lot. So you should be able to identify the economic and political results of the War of Mongol Conquest, the Mongol Conquest. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Peace and love. Rock and roll in the free world. Stop.